So today's webcast is going to focus on modifying reading instruction for students in special education. As we know, students have a variety of needs and we're working with diverse learners. And so the process of reading instruction may need to be modified based on the special needs of our students. So for example, we're going to be talking about students with specific learning disabilities in reading. We're going to be talking about students on the autism spectrum, including Asperger's syndrome. Other health and physical challenges, including mobility issues, students with fine motor skill difficulties, and intellectual disabilities and cognitive impairments, including students with IQs below 50. So starting with students with specific learning disabilities in reading, specific learning disabilities by far make up the largest percentage of students in special education. And generally the rule of thumb at this point is that unless otherwise specified, it's helpful to assume that students with reading disabilities that's generally caused by dyslexia. And what that means is that instruction needs to begin with adequate phonological awareness practice to ensure that students have mastery of those consonant and vowel sounds in Chapter 1. We use kinesthetic cues because vowels can be really difficult for students to discriminate. And as we dictate with students, you'll see that the instructor provides those kinesthetic cues. That helps students to know which vowel to use.
The short vowel sound of the letter A is A. To make this kinesthetic cue for this sound, hold your hand as if you were holding an apple. Bring your hand to your mouth as you make the sound A. The next vowel in our sequence of instruction is the letter E. The short sound of the vowel E is E, as in the word echo. For this cue, cup your hand around your ear as if you are listening to hear an echo and say E. The third vowel is the letter O. The short sound for O is A, as in the word opera. To make this cue, place your hands together in front of you as if you were an opera singer and either say or sing, ah. The next vowel is the letter U. The short sound of U is as in the word up. To make this cue, create a U shape with your arms like this as you make the sound It may be helpful for your students to imagine a baby wanting to be picked up. The final vowel is the letter I. The short sound of I is I, as in the word itch. For this cue, lift your arm and pretend to scratch an itch like this and say I.
For many students with specific learning disabilities in reading, they are going to need lots and lots of practice. For example, a neurotypical reader needs generally 1 to 4 exposures to a word to be able to store that in their visual memory. However, students with dyslexia may need double or triple the amount of exposures. Marianne Wolf recently said in a presentation that some students may need 5 exposures, some students may need 10 exposures, and some students may need 100 exposures. So the really important issue is that every student has the time and the repetition to be able to gain the skill before they're asked to move on. With younger students, we do use hand motions, but for older students and students with physical challenges in particular, the hand motions are not necessary. The process of dictation, however, is extremely important for creating neural pathways in the brain. And so the process of dictation is that the teacher dictates a sound, a slide, a word, or a sentence twice. The student repeats it twice, they write it once, and then they read it together twice. So generally, that happens in whole classrooms or in small group instruction. And so that would typically look like this with hand motions.
Tent, tent.
Tent, tent.
Turn around and write your word. I use a tent when I go camping.
But when we're working with students with special needs, often typical dictation and other parts of the direct instruction may have to be modified. So today what we're going to do is talk about ways to modify for different populations. Often we may need to modify with students who have health impairments or other physical challenges. For example, dysgraphia may make it difficult for students to write during dictation. Students who have fine and gross motor skill issues may have difficulty. Students with cerebral palsy or muscular dystrophy. So the whole point is that we do not want to work on handwriting at the same time we're working on reading. And so there are lots of options for that, including having students work on letter formation by using letter formation pages. This is the kindergarten version, and that means students of any age can use them if we want to do a single letter at a time, or if a student is working on a letter group. This is particularly helpful because letter group 1 has both B and D, and that helps students practice the formation. Especially students with dyslexia often have reversals. So that's really useful. You can put those in a page protector, and then students can just write and erase. However, if students have those kinds of challenges, they will not generally be able to do dictation in the same way. So we are going to talk about how to modify dictation. So you can put this away. So another way to do dictation is, let's just say with letter group 1. We're going to start with our vowel A. And Oliver, what's the sound of the vowel A? Ah, right? Okay, and then the other letters in the letter group are, what's that letter?
B.
Great, and tell me the sound for B.
B.
Good. What's the letter?
F.
Tell me the sound for F. Great, and the letter is?
D.
And the sound is?
D.
And the letter is?
G.
And the sound is?
G.
Great. So for students that have challenges that may impact their ability to write during dictation, there's another way to modify that is as effective for students. So Oliver, I'm going to dictate a word for you, okay? Then you're going to repeat it, and then you're going to pull down the cards to create that word, okay? So the word is fad, fad.
Fad. Fad.
Right. And have you ever heard that word before, fad?
No.
A fad is kind of like a trend. It's really popular for a while, but it's not always going to be popular. Sometimes it happens with what clothes people wear or music or games or something like that. Okay, so now what are you going to do to mark the word, going left to right?
The X under the A.
Right, and why does the X go into the A?
Because it's a vowel.
Beautiful. And let's read the word together. Fad, fad. Okay, just like that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the next letter set. And we still just maintain one vowel, and we introduce more consonants because we can build more words and still practice with our vowel A, okay? All right, so you ready? So now I'm going to give you another word. Ready? The word is jam, jam. Send it back.
Jam, jam.
Which letters would create the word jam?
J, A, M.
Okay, beautiful. And what would you mark?
The A.
Okay, and read the word twice for me. Jam, jam.
Jam.
Now, you know about jam, I'm sure. Can you use jam in a sentence?
I had jam for breakfast.
Okay, so
Jam with toast for
beautiful. Have you ever heard jam used in another way? Like if somebody really jams to music, or they have like a jam session, something like that? Or what about when you get in a jam? So that word can be used in lots of different ways, right? Okay, let's do a nonsense word. Okay, so what do we have to put in front of a nonsense word?
Star.
Right, so that tells us it's a nonsense word. You ready? Fam, fam.
Fam, fam.
Beautiful. And what will you mark?
The A.
And read that twice.
Fam, fam.
Beautiful. Okay. As students get into higher chapters, obviously they have more components. So now in chapter 2, for example, we've introduced blends. By now, students have all of their consonant and vowel sounds to mastery. And so the whole point is that students who have physical challenges and may have difficulty with dictation can still continue to develop their reading skills and build those foundational skills they'll need for reading. So, all right, Talia, you ready? So the word is S-A-N-D, S-A-N-D.
S-A-N-D, S-A-N.
Beautiful. We're going to move that up just a little bit. Okay, now what are you going to mark? Okay, so tell me what you did and why.
I marked under my vowel because I kind of have.
It's a vowel.
Yeah. And I marked my guardians.
Okay.
And
So you went up and around the back of the word and marked your D, then your end, and
I marked it short because it doesn't say A, it says A.
right. And why does it say that? Because it's got 2 consonants after the vowel, right? So what's the word then?
Sand.
Great. Can you use that in a sentence?
There is sand at the beach.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have you read some words for me off the transfer card.
Best, silk, jazz, egg,
Okay, move over to this line, this row.
mask, bunch, lump, crisp, squint.
Nice, like this. Okay, now can you read that sentence for me?
She will mend the slick quilt.
What's it? Say it again.
Silk.
Say it again. Read it again.
She will mend the silk quilt.
Good. And what about the next one?
The golf ball is in the pond.
Okay. So if a student had mobility issues such that they couldn't do that level of dictation where they were able to pull cards, for example, a student in a wheelchair, then it's possible for students to dictate to you. So basically they're walking through the process verbally without having to use any physical activities on their part. So I'm going to tell you what the word is, and then you're going to tell me what letters, and then you're going to tell me what to do with the word, just the same way that we were doing before. The word is rust, rust.
Rust. Rust.
How would you spell rust?
R-U-S-T.
Okay. Now, what would you do to prove that word?
You would X under the vowel. And you would mark your blend. And then you would come up and around and mark your guardians.
And 2 guardians will make the vowel.
Short.
All right, great. And what's the word?
Rust.
How could you use that in a sentence?
There was a rusty nail on the floor.
Got it. So things that stay out in the weather, in the water, get wet, can get rust on them, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, what about this word? This is going to have a 3-letter little S blend. You ready? The word is split, split.
Split, split.
How would you spell split?
S-P-L-I-T.
Okay, now what would you do?
Mark your blend.
And what's your blend this time?
S-P-L.
Great, so arc your 3-letter blend.
Mark under your vowel. Mark your guardian.
And how many guardians are there this time?
Just 1.
Okay, and that will do what to your vowel?
It will still make it short.
Okay, and what's the word?
Split.
Great, now I'm going to spell a word, so I'm just going to write it and you're going to tell me what to do with it. Ready? Wait, let me write that down. Okay, so tell me what you would do.
You would arc your blend.
CL blend.
X under your vowel. Arc your other blend.
SP.
And you would mark your guardians. And that would make it short.
And the word would be?
Clasp.
Clasp. And do you know what a clasp is?
No clue.
Okay, so you know on a necklace or something,
Yeah.
the little thing that you have to do that holds it together, that's called a clasp.
Oh.
Or if you go like this with somebody's hand, that's clasping their hand. Okay, so clasp can mean other things too. Okay, and then let's read the word together twice. Clasp, clasp. Beautiful. So without the student having to actually write anything, it's possible for them to do dictation just with a modification. Another option is the use of magnetic letters to make dictation and decoding easier. You can adjust the number of letters the student is working with based on ability. Let's talk now about students on the autism spectrum. Well, every student on the spectrum is unique. There are some common characteristics. For example, when students are on the software, you might have to limit their access to games in the clubhouse. often students get really kind of fixated on a particular area, and it's very difficult to get them off. And so you kind of want to use the carrot approach where, once students complete so many minutes or a lesson or something like that, then they're able to play games. Another thing is that often students on the spectrum have sensory issues, and that means that writing can be very uncomfortable for them. So finding, the right kind of marker that's comfortable for them, or finding another support for writing. But some students are going to do better using the software. They don't have to write when they are coding on the software, and that makes it much easier for many of those students. Also, if a student is nonverbal, again, the software doesn't require any process. The process of dictation doesn't take place in the same way, and students are able to complete a lesson and get all the way through the program without having to be verbal. One of the things that's very important is that when students are on software, they may need a range of accommodations to be able to use the software effectively. And if there are mobility issues, or if there are fine motor skill or developmental issues, the use of accessibility functions on software can be really helpful. And so, for example, Reading Horizons software developers have included accessibility functions so that you don't, for example, have to use a mouse, and students can use keys to navigate through particular activities. That can happen in lessons, vocabulary, etc. So another thing that can be useful with students with health impairments and mobility issues is the use of the transfer cards. Those can be projected as whole class transfer cards, and even in a group, a student could participate in that way because they're used for choral reading. Or you can use them as a way for students to confirm mastery of an understanding of a skill or concept, and then use the transfer card to confirm that they can decode the words in that skill. And that also allows for transfer of text because there are sentences on each card. And if students can read the transfer cards, they are ready to move to reading text. For students with intellectual disabilities or cognitive impairments, the first question is to really ask, what can the student already do? For example, do they know their colors? And are they able to hold that in memory? Do they know the letters in their name? If they don't, if they're not able to do those functions, they may not be yet ready for print. And so one of the things that really is helpful is to start with phonological awareness activities, those sounds, because those are not yet connected to print. And that's an important first feature anyway. With students with intellectual disabilities, one of the things we really want to think about is our time. How much time are we spending? So we may need to modify lessons to be much shorter. 10 or 15 minutes may be, more than enough for a student. We generally wouldn't recommend nonsense words. Those don't help build vocabulary, and it may help them to have something that's more concrete. Anything that would increase the cognitive load, we want to stay away from. For example, making use of the posters and things like that so they have visual reference when needed is important. Also, as we introduce information, we want to make sure that we limit it to their ability. For example, letter group 1 has 4 consonants and a vowel in first grade and beyond, but you may have students who need to start with a kindergarten sequence. So that means 1 letter at a time, and then building very carefully to a slide and then to a real word with basic markings. In some cases, those students may be on letter group 1 for a long time because they're really connecting that phonemic awareness to print. And so the whole focus is on helping them understand how words work and connecting those sounds to print. Decodable text, the little books that are used in 1st through 3rd grade, may be too complex for students who are very low. There are kindergarten little books that have even lower level text with only 1 sentence on each page. The little books have images to help with comprehension. So you really want to modify your instruction. And again, the transfer cards have sentences, simple sentences that connect to the skill. So there are lots of resources. For example, the most common words, the high frequency words, can be found on Accelerate, RH Accelerate, with in word wall format or flashcard format, just to help students practice. But again, really limiting the amount of information that students are working with at a time until they have mastered it. Sometimes teachers will ask, or they'll say that a student is not getting it. And when I ask what they're doing, it turns out, the student's working on numbers and letters and, lots of volume of things. And they really need to limit that and just focus on what they can handle at one time. And sometimes that's a very slow process, but it's an important one. And again, we're helping students develop skills. When students are not yet able to read books on their own, reading aloud allows them to develop a love of reading and helps them to access texts that they can't yet decode. The use of audiobooks can also be very useful, especially for older students who can follow along as the narrator reads the text. Students can often comprehend what they hear at a considerably higher level than text they can read themselves. Research tells us that all but about 5% of students actually can learn to read, and there's actually good research that shows that students with cognitive impairments can become good readers if they have instruction provided them in the right way. How does Reading Horizons address short-term memory and auditory processing difficulties? The program addresses both short-term memory and working memory deficits. The process of proving words from simple to more complex uses a spatial process, and it reduces the demand on working memory. The spatial process creates a road around the word that is easy to follow, and it prompts each step. This process is far more effective with students with intellectual disabilities than rote memorization. And the framework provides one skill at a time and not moving on until the student has mastered a current skill. So there are a number of features on the software that can be really helpful in terms of working with students with a variety of special needs. We know that students on IEPs will have IEP goals connected to reading if that's in fact their classification. And so one of the important things is to match progress monitoring and benchmarking to the percentage listed in the IEP goal. So on the software, the default is set for lesson passage percentage and test passing percentages to 85%. However, that can be adjusted by the instructor so that if an IEP goal says 70%, you can adjust the lesson passing percent or test passing percent to that same goal. And therefore, you get data really connected to their IEP goal. Something else that's very motivational, and this is helpful for kids on the spectrum and other students who need to have that more immediate result, is you can provide coins on the software by adding them in the class role. So for example, if a student is working with you on dictation, or they're spending time in a lesson or adding words to their word wall or something like that, you can go ahead and as an incentive say, I just added 20 coins to your bank, and therefore they can use that for on game days and things like that to play games or to decorate their clubhouse. I mentioned earlier that sometimes students can get rather fixated on and use instructional time where they want to play games and things like that. But the software also allows you to give students free game days where they don't have to spend coins. That's really motivating for them. And so there are so many features within the software that really you can customize to meet the needs of students. And sometimes that just means that certain students need particular kinds of modifications, and you can do that by student, by group, or by a whole class. So the software makes it really easy to match the goals of instruction and intervention. Here are some questions that were submitted. We always suggest teaching to mastery, and we define mastery as 85% in a Tier 1 setting, so the teacher can still move forward with the majority of the class. How does a special education teacher move forward with a class or a group if there are still 1 to 2 strugglers? Do we recommend specific one-on-one time, or what is the best approach to help the lowest students? That's a great question. We touched on this a little earlier when I mentioned adjusting passing percentage on the software. Instead of defining mastery at a certain percentage, we really should be adjusting mastery to the ability of the student. Hopefully that's been identified in the IEP goals, but if it hasn't, it is possible to use dictation as the formative assessment. It is very likely that you will have some students who will not demonstrate mastery as rapidly as others, and fortunately you'll be able to identify those students right away. For example, Students who have difficulty hearing individual speech sounds will often need more time and more practice. Instead of moving them on when the rest of the group is in centers working on a more advanced skill or reading in higher level little books, these students may need to work on slides and building words or segmenting each sound and then blending them together in the word. Practice pages can be helpful, as well as using the vocabulary section to add additional words to the word wall. The bottom line is that moving students forward into more complex material will not help them be successful. If we can take time out of the process and continually refer back to what the student or students are capable of doing right now, that really helps guide the approach. Remember that if a student isn't able to understand or retain what you're doing with them, you'll need to back up. Our next question is, what about special ed populations with a high percentage of ELL students? Are there any tips to working with this special crossover section of students? That's a really good question, and an issue that can be particularly challenging because there are so many factors. We know that students who were reading and writing in their native language have an advantage because they were already connecting sounds to print. And we also know that dyslexia can occur in any printed language. But there are a few studies that indicate that the 5 essential components of reading instruction, as identified by the National Reading Panel, will work for this population as well. So that phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Phonemic awareness is particularly important for students learning English because it is the sounds of the letters, particularly vowels, that can be so confusing for them. And then understanding how those sounds connect to the letters in English and the specific patterns for words and syllables must occur in order for ELL students to be able to read and write. This is also a challenge if you've got classrooms that are mixed. So maybe all special ed students, but some students who are also ELL students will really necessitate some grouping so that those students have more time and practice and maybe are moving much more slowly. The pronunciation tool in the software is really useful for helping students to hear and practice the individual speech sounds. And reading programs for English language learners must include intensive language development. So having the students spend more time in the vocabulary section of the software and making sure to include vocabulary in the speaking and listening portion of direct instruction is important. Finding appropriate ways to connect to the student's native language will also help with meaning. The research says that it takes somewhere between 4 and 7 years for students to develop proficiency in English, and for students with dyslexia and other special needs, this will often go more slowly and take much longer. Our next question is, how does transfer look different in special education classrooms? We know that transfer is an important part of reading instruction. As we mentioned, the transfer cards can be very useful because they help to identify if a student can apply the skills first with words in isolation and then in sentences. Using the kindergarten materials for students with intellectual disabilities may be appropriate, as we mentioned, and transfer may also need to be chunked into smaller sections and for shorter periods of time with lots of repetition. Even within small groups, teachers may need to rotate students so that each student is receiving the level of transfer that they're capable of. Remember that transfer is any activity that takes a skill from isolation to application. So games and activities can also be a good way to help students connect skills and improve retention. Using the supplement, the game supplement, can be a really helpful way for students to have fun and really be able to connect and apply those skills over time. Our next question is, how can a special education teacher check for retention throughout instruction? Again, that's a very good question. The Reading Horizons program is designed to check for retention at each step. So every direct instruction lesson or intervention period begins with a review so that the teacher can determine how much of the previous lesson has been retained. Typically, it will take several days to thoroughly cover a lesson. That includes guided practice and reading connected text. If students haven't mastered the content and are unable to demonstrate that they can apply the skill to reading and writing, then more time will be needed before moving on. checkups, those short reviews after every skill, can either be taken on the software or by paper and pencil. And they're always good ways to check for retention because they're so short. And data from the software also helps with understanding where students may need more instruction or review. And then the differentiation sections in the direct instruction materials also provide options for working with students who need more support. Our last question is, if a student is struggling with retention of vowel sound knowledge in middle school, what are some ways to support that? Vowels are an area where many students struggle regardless of grade. This is particularly true of students who are learning English because the sounds may differ greatly. Kinesthetic cues and the use of the pronunciation tool are two very beneficial components of the program and can make a major difference. Phonemic awareness is the key to connecting to print, and teachers may need to back up and adequately support students by using more phonemic awareness activities if this is a difficulty. If they're still struggling, I would recommend a speech and language evaluation. Students with auditory processing disorders, for example, often find it very difficult to discriminate sounds in a classroom where there is noise. Phonics phones, sometimes called whisper phones, can also help students with these difficulties. That's all the time we have for questions today. If you have additional questions, please send me an email and I'll be sure to respond. Thanks for watching.